Welcome to Between Shelves,
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and Meta-Modernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
to learn,
listen,
and become.
Hello, everyone. It's great to have you all here. To Between Shelves. We have Aaron with us, myself, but we also have a wonderful special guest with us, a good friend of ours, Dr. Philip Butler, who's at the Iliff School of Theology. I'm not going to say too much, but just a quick bio. He is focusing on neuroscience, technology, and spirituality and Blackness, right? All those four pieces. You know, he's delved into Afro-Futurism, Afro-diasporic movements. He has this powerful app that I would really like for you to talk about, Seeker, and how it really helps people of color, Black people to really do that type of, I always call it that first tier level of support, and help in terms of helping and talking through things Sorry, I'm at a loss for words. I'm just excited. But you've been doing a lot of work, and I've loved that trajectory. So I'm going to hold back, and I would love for you to talk a little bit about you, what you do, what you've been working on, and maybe bringing us this fascinating topic of transhumanism and how you understand it and how you see it working.
First, I want to say that I'm jealous. I have the shortest beard on this podcast, and so I just want everybody to know that I've been working really hard on this beard, but it is no match for what I'm sitting next to right now. But it's an honor to be here. I'm grateful to share this space. It's a privilege to be able to continue conversations that have been happening for almost a decade, maybe even longer, depending on where you think they started. And so I'm going to try to maybe, mill piece this, right? So I think in terms of, right, this transhumanist piece. So like for me, I start with Nick Bostrom's conversation, or at least the definition of, like, it's a paraphrasing, right? A transhumanism is any, right, use of technology to augment the psychological, spiritual, physical and intellectual. And his is less about the spiritual, more intellectual, physical, and psychological. And I add this spiritual. You could think about this in terms of Nietzsche. But for me, then in terms of like a Black post-humanism, right? Kind of when I was writing a text, especially when I was going back and kind of looking over some of the notes, kind of had this crossroads, which kind of set me on this path where just kind of looking at the history of humanity and the ways that it is been delivered to us in the West, and the ways that we find that the concept, the term, right, and the embodiment of it is either extended to certain folks fully and then, retracted to other folks, or retracted from other folks, right, depending upon the context. And so, I think I end this particular chapter, right, kind of like if I had to give up my Blackness or my humanity, I would give up my humanity. Mainly because for me, the term human in this way, right, becomes an extension of white supremacy. But given, this is me writing in 2018, 2019. So like now, if you look more closely at it, I would also just maybe argue, right, that humanity is more so a conceptual node connected to a proximity to power. Because if we're talking about it, right, from the Western trajectory, you go to the Enlightenment humanism, you go further back to Greek philosophy. But then if you go back maybe one dial further, you're going back to like, Egypt. So Egyptians, similar to the Greeks and the white folks from Western Europe, would say, they're the only humans. And so anybody outside of empire, right, anybody outside of a dynastic space, right, might be considered less than human because they're not a part of a particular kind of power structure. And if that's the case, right, then we're talking about technology in a cybernetic linguistic capacity, right, of human as a semiotic. And if that's the case, right, then, we could also argue that nobody's human. And you could also argue that nobody's anything else. But I think the way that humanity is deployed against folks, in the way that people are constantly grasping at it in order to be included within it becomes the very thing in way on which I say that it is kind of negatively deployed or at least weaponized, right, against the folks whose humanity has often been retracted. I think I'll put a pause there.
So blow up. That's amazing. And what's interesting that you brought up there was that you even brought the human, just even defining humanism, right? Or the human as a criteria amongst empire. That's something we're always engaging in what it means to be human, right? And we're always fighting with it. But it's always a term that is brought about by empire, and whoever has power has control, and then thus has control over defining what does it mean to be human. And I think we're seeing that even now in our struggles, right, with the Constitution and current administration. They're defining what it means to be human. Who's the human? Who's allowed here in the United States, right? And they're also defining that by its use of technology, right? If you don't have this certain account, if you don't have certain access, who has real power to it? You know, that the fact that they've stopped everything and it's being, you are not human. You don't have power. You're not really in this space as I am, and I have control. So I just wanted to thank you for that pause, because that is a pivotal thought, that this term human is still co-opted by, and even if we have these attempts to decolonize it, they still have that control. And so even letting that go, the thought of letting go, even the term human, is interesting.
Now it threw me off a little bit. I'm not gonna hold you, and I think in many ways, I think it was also very freeing, right? Because it's like if I don't have to keep trying to like be let into this particular club, right? Then my possibilities become that much more exponential, because I'm not. I think it's Ames is there, and you'll get, Fred Moten that'll repeat this, like this refusal to be a singular thing. And if I refuse to, right, be, confounded or confined, right, to the constraints of humanity, right, then I can live into whether you call it my divinity, even my, will throw some people off, right? But even being a demon or being something, anything like good, bad, ugly, whatever, my capacity becomes limitless in that case. And I'm not to get like jump too far ahead, but like, the work I've been doing, as of late, and where I find myself now is within this post-humanist space. And so, like, even when you talk about the Constitution, maybe think about the term "we the people." And so, what I've been doing lately is differentiating between humanity and personhood. And where we talk about like humans are this, if we're talking about humans as a technology, a cybernetic and symbiotic, technology, right? That's meant to create boundaries around people's imagination and their minds, then a person becomes a local and complex thing. It's not a universal construct anymore. It's not something that has to be one particular thing or that people have to contort to fit within, right? That you can be as complex, right? You can be as varied, you can be as different as you need to be, living into whatever it is that you are. And I think being a person or living into what it means to be a people, I think it's even more grounding within the land, within ancestral, stuff that's the people, I think, is a much more clear talk about what it means to be somebody in connection and being somebody that is tapped in, not only to their own body, but the social and relational aspects of who they are and where they find themselves.
Aaron, I don't know if you want to go in, but I did want to highlight something there that's really interesting. One of the things we've been doing in our podcast is really talking about meta-modernism. And Meta-Modernism, in a nutshell, really tries to do two things. It understands we can't do modernity well. We can't do it anymore. But we can't do postmodernity as well because of something that you mentioned, that the person becomes a complex thing. And one of the critiques Meta-Modernism gives of postmodernity is, if you're everything, you're nothing. And so you have this complexity but the way you bring it about, is interesting and something I've been fighting with. It's like, no, there's still some real good stuff in post-structuralism and postmodern thinking, and that we are complex beings and that we shouldn't put ourselves in this little box and stay within this category. That rather, it's we become as necessary in the spaces, which also allows us to get away from it, right? Because if I'm only this, that's a problem. And so I guess the question is, is this where you get your fascination or your movement into Afro-Futurist spaces and things of that nature, or does it lead you to somewhere else?
So So this is like where, and I'll say this, and I know that, people are like, this guy keeps saying this weird stuff, but like, I said that, black transhumanism is undergirded by black posthumanism. But I've been spending this time really like the last 4 years unpacking for me what this black posthumanist space is. And when you talk about getting into this Afro-Futurism space, for me, like when we start talking about this in terms of complexity, one, I actually want to do a real quick stop on this everything into nothingness. I think the journey into nothingness is actually a really beautiful journey, right? Because not only can you be everything if you wanted to, but if you know that, then almost you allow yourself to be a tabula rasa in the sense that you're waxing everything that is temporary off of you. And anything that you can be is something that you maybe won't be later, which suggests that you can move towards nothingness and still be embodied. But also the things that you are very particular because of the body that you have and genetic structure and histories and everything that you got. At the same time, moving toward this Afrofuturist space, like for me, it's like being Ronaldo Anderson, who I part of, he's been leading the BSAM movement for a while, man, kicking it with him since really 2018. And he'll define, at least he has defined Afrofuturism as being able to see anywhere that you're able to see yourself in history. And so it's really about like, but I think when you look at this, being able to see yourself is not just like a particular representation, like, oh, I'm in this story, but I think it speaks to like Yazi Everett, who wrote the Liminal People series, right? Like seeing yourself in terms of black speculativeness is about the granularity of existence, right? It's the good, it's the rough edges, it's the texture, right? That lets you know that you're somewhere very specific. And I think I was having a conversation maybe about close to a year ago, and people were like, well, everybody, kind of argues about these particularities, like the tip of the pyramid. And I'm like, I would think that that's where the magic is, because if everybody can speak in a broad sense, then you're not really materializing anything. When we talk about the granularity, you're talking about that, like the very, very tip of the pyramid that allows for materialization or manifestation to occur. And I think that that's the space that we have not spent enough time with, because it requires us to do and be something different than the historical constructs and limitations have allowed, because it looks too much like magic, or it looks too much like playing God, or and so in that sense, like there's you got to have a willingness, or an audacity or a boldness, right, to step into these spaces that people refuse to inhabit. But in their refusal to inhabit, you could argue or question whether or not that refusal is what's not giving us, right, the very things that we're looking to manifest, if that makes sense at all.
That's powerful. And you brought me back to my Whiteheadian stuff.
Yes.
He talks in this one chapter called Immortality. I was with Dr. Waldron. I was speaking with this a while back, and where he talks about value has no value unless it's evaluated, which means this is evaluated in a particular thing, within a particular context, in a particular perspective, maybe symbolized, right? And so it seems like you're saying this in a very real way, right? Looking at that detail, looking at that pinnacle, looking at the material. Unless that's materialized, you don't see that supernaturalness within it that makes it so special, so much that we want to focus on and say, hey, have you seen this? But it has to be materialized, and that means it's honoring the fullness, right? It's not only that inner piece, but it's that inner piece realized in the outer, so that others can see, right? I think that's a fascinating way of seeing that. That's awesome. That's awesome.
I think it's been pretty challenging for me, because like part of the, I guess, like the decolonial and the anti-colonial spaces that I've been finding myself as of late places me, like, for instance, CST, right? They would talk about internal family systems all the time. And I've been playing with that within the last few years, but then connecting it to like personhood. And I came across this article on Haitian voodoo, and would talk about like the 7 types of souls with potentially infinite souls altogether. And so in IFS, you would say that there's like each part, like this is like this untainted self, and then there's all these parts, and the goal is to walk in harmony. But like if you play and get to know these selves, you find the self energy within each part, which would then make me question like this. So then if we looked at the soul as like the image of God, or I looked at each part as like the image of God or a soul or even a spirit, and if every part has this energy, so does that mean that every part is like a different soul? And so when we talk about being any and everything at any given moment, or, the necessary aspects of you that need to rise to the occasion, so to speak, right now we're talking about like the ability to embody not just like anything for, as a conceptual thing, like, oh, this person's being this at this moment. No, it's an actual entity, right? And where I think it puts a new spin on like the notions around possession. And it's like growing up in a Christian household, you can only be possessed by the Holy Spirit. You couldn't even possess yourself because that would be sacrilegious. But if we're looking at it from this decolonial kind of anti-colonial space and going back into these African traditional religions and their own, kind of diasporic elements, then you have an infinite amount of souls that you could potentially tap into. And what does it mean to allow them to surface at any given moment where they are most necessary? And which then goes back to the everything and nothing piece, but it is filtered through a specific body. So you're always going to be, at the very least, that body, but whatever it is that comes to the surface of that moment becomes the very thing that you allow that body to, I guess, to demonstrate, right? Or at the very least present to the world.
Funny, I was two things come to my mind as you're hearing that. I make these connections. The law of attraction, which is a particular text that's finding popularity, really talks about this when going through meditation and allowing this other to arise and can speak forth. And we've been seeing around it. It's been interesting because it's exactly what you're saying, right? Allowing these spirits to, or this muse almost, right? If we would take that Greek idea of the muse to come up and allow it to do its thing in and through us. And what that kind of means, and alluding to what you're alluding to, is that we're not held to just this one idea of spirit, right? That it's a Holy Spirit, it's a Christian, but it could be any of these. It's a reinvitation of allowing the spirits to move in. I have there's a lot of, you brought me back to a book called Spirits of the Rainforest. I don't know if you ever read that text, but it's talking about Christian missionaries and how their work really devastated the religion of the Amazonian tribes, where they said, they can look at you and there's a hole or there's a well, but within it, they can see the spirits. And in the end of the text, one of them says, man, your well's empty. And he goes, I found this because, but your well is empty. It's fascinating, that part of bringing back this idea of this manyness of spirits that we can allow in, and that's a powerful piece. I think it would scare.
I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does.
Scare. It's not a concept, right? We've dealt with a Eurocentric concept of this oneness, but everything that you're doing is really talking about the multiplicity,
for sure,
of our singularness, right? It's like in this space right now, there's this multiplicity.
Yeah, and I think one of the beautiful things about it is like, if it can come up in you, then it's a part of you, and I think that's what people are afraid of. Like they're like, oh no, you've been possessed by something. No, you've been possessed by something that has always been there. And, but I think the beautiful thing about it is, like, it's one thing for it to take over. And you could argue that, like, anytime you have a strong emotion that you lose control, it's something, you're being taken over by something. But I think the beautiful thing about it is if you get to know these different parts of yourself, then it's no longer like a taking over of something I don't trust or I don't know. Right. It's a handoff, so to speak. And it's like, oh, I know this thing. I know this part. I know this, the spirit that's coming to the top. And I don't have to police it in the same way because I trust it, because I've spent time with it. Right. Because I spent time with myself. And I think in the very transhumanist way, like it's a particular type of technology, going back to what we talked about in terms of the early definition, right, of like the spiritual augmentation. Right. Because, in a quasi or semi, right, practical sense, like depending upon the situation somebody's in, right, their body responds very differently. Like when you see mothers lift cars off of their children, right, or people, run much faster than they normally run, or jump higher, whatever it is, depending upon the context, right, you could argue that, something took over in that moment. And so the question becomes like, how much of yourself do you know to not just let that happen under those duress moments? What if you needed that in an everyday moment? Something that seemingly what might have been frightening, 5 minutes ago, but because the multiplicity of yourself and the various aspects of who you are, all right, it can come to that surface right now and not have to be a life or death thing. Because I'm talking about chaos.
Yeah. You remind me of the little work I did with my dissertation on religious trauma. And how, for myself, experiencing my own religious trauma, we had to explore Jungian psychology and really look at these psychoanalytical concepts and ideas. And it was so interesting how the theories of archetypes came up. And what you were saying is very similar to that, just through the psychoanalytical term, how we have these many selves, part of become whole. And there's a part of ourself that is the shadow. And we struggle with understanding how do we have a relationship with that part of ourself. And so we have in particular religions, monotheistic religions like Christianity, the tendency to teach people that the darkness is bad and stay away from that. So then when you're looking at it from a psychoanalytical term, you're saying, well, the shadow's not necessarily bad. It's just misunderstood. And so then, like you are doing, this decolonial journey is about stepping into the abyss, that darkness, that unknown, and saying, wait, it actually isn't that bad. This is more connecting, maybe feels more like home, because at the end of it, theopoetically, we've been stolen from our homes, by these imperialistic colonial structures, But I love what you're saying and you're implying here too, because we're in a digital age. And what does that mean in terms of data, being online, information, our experiences, right now, what Meta has access to our photos and all these things of our lives, but we produce that data and we upload that data, and we loved what you were talking about in a paper you did or a journal article you published. And it was amazing talking about these things such as like the technosphere, and this concept. Is it possible that you could break that down or explain that, like this technosphere and all that?
You might remind me what I was talking about. I ain't gonna. No, but no, and I'm glad you're bringing it back. And so, I think that some of this was important in terms of laying a foundation, right? But the technical piece, this is more every day where everybody kind of hangs out, and so I think in a nutshell, when we talk about this technosphere, we're talking about this container of our various digital, right, and even quantum selves, depending upon where you exist on that space. And it houses, like you said, these various iterations of who we are, or at least who we present to the world. And so, I think it gives us the opportunity, right, to not only navigate different spaces, but I think it's also a way to talk about a different world altogether, right, that has different geographic I love the word constellation, but I think it's different geographical kind of points, whereby you could say like Meta is one, or X, X is another, or whatever, the places that you hang out are. And each of these become, a chance for you to either replicate what you are across all of them, present different, versions of yourself across them, but each one of them is going to be representative of, at the very least. Now, what I mean by representative is it's going to extend out of, right, the way that you want to be seen. Because I think in that same article, you're probably talking about the one that's talking about like a code of ethics or a way of life, something like that.
Yes.
Perfect. And so for me, in this sense, this is where, I think that was one iteration of my definition of spirituality ago, right? So in this sense, spirituality is like your code of ethics. It's the way that you actually live your life. And so if you want to be provocative, but also, clandestine, then you're probably going to, put cryptic stuff out on the web, but also maybe say things that garner some type of attention, at least the type of attention you think you want. Nevertheless, it's going to extend out of how you understand the world to be and maybe the change you want to make, or however you want to be seen out there. And then again, on another platform, it may be a different iteration of that, just so that people don't get, maybe too comfortable, or at the very least say they know who you are. But I think even as a part of this, your way of life is going to dictate. And then I think your way of life is different from your proclaimed or professed faith tradition. And I want to be clear about that. It's one thing to say that you're a part of something, but I think your actions are going to be very much indicative of what you actually believe and feel. And you could say that people are putting up smoke and mirrors, and you could, which I think is a different conversation altogether. But nevertheless, what you're going to come up against is people's chosen way of life in conversation with the mediums that they engage with. And so that's kind of what that is. And it's funny. That's awesome. And when I said awesome, is to see the writings and then hear people talk back about it, but realize where you are at this present moment maybe not be the same space.
With that, it's interesting how we translate who we are into information or data, which is, I think, what you're kind of saying. And then so when you are replicating yourself in these spaces, the fact that you're saying that we place ourselves in a certain way to say how we want to be seen, right? And that's branding, right? That's just marketing. If we do that in a nutshell, as branding and marketing. But even in those spaces, we seem to be co-opted because they're saying, okay, you got to present your best self, and this is how you do it, and reducing us to it. And I'm jumping in. I sometimes want to say that there's a loss of creativity and imaginativeness once we turn into information, but then we look at best practices because it doesn't allow for that type of growth. I say that as sort of like this danger of sort of these constant repetitions. You're not doing that in your work. I just, but to talk about, that this move into information kind of puts us in zeros and ones, and then we look like the same. And actually what you're kind of saying with that is saying, no, we are multiplicity. We are zeros and ones. We do have that layer, but we can highlight these specific zeros and ones, these specific bits of data, and say, that's awesome. And you should look at this and you should see this. And I think that's what you're offering as this uniqueness of how we look at technology, how we look at data, and how we use data to create ourselves, but also to liberate ourselves within this technological sphere, and also to define our identity for ourselves where we may be lost right in there. So just wanted to throw that in there. That's what I kind of see that. And that's kind of a powerful piece because you do provide somewhat of a shaman's guide to that.
You're very kind. And I think so like I think in the last piece I put out, it's in the Georgetown Law Journal, and it's on I think blackness and Web3 technology and data ownership, right? And so in that one, we're looking at like what it would mean if we were able to have data covered under the law as an extension of a physical body. So anything that you would do to the data, you would have to treat it in the same way as a physical body. So like, what does harm look like against data? What are data rights? Can you kidnap it, right? Or entrap it, or, whatever the way, whatever that looks like. But as a result of that, right, any echo of your presence on the web or whatever, right, becomes something that is not only owned by you, right, but is an extension of your physicality, right? Because physical movements, whether it be a tap or a walking around or whatever it is, right, these are the things that have become tracked. And so, yeah, it does become, a type of, kind of 1 and 0 in a way, and these are your ones and zeros. And so, in that sense, right, I think this is kind of what, to your point, like this is where the agency comes in, because in terms of complexity, right, and creativity and specificity, right, everyone's ones and zeros are not going to be the same. And so, even when you talk about marketing to specific types of people, you're also having a conversation about like, like behaviors. And so it's obviously not going to be the same person, but these are people within this particular demographic who engage in similar enough behaviors that we could probably market this thing to. And so I think even as a result of that, the question becomes, right, if you were to own your data, what kind of beautiful things might you be able to build? Like, even if you're not the most technological person, right, or technical person, you'll be, like I think the short story that we give is connected to another short story, and I think in the Critical Black Futures text. But the idea is that, right, if you own your data, you almost would have to consider a sub-economy whereby anytime the data is traded, you'd have to find a way to benefit that, whether it be, a few cents here or access to, your light bill, utilities or whatever it is, right? These are ways that we might be able to change the future simply by engaging in a data economy and being able to let everybody, literally everyone, right, have the capacity to do that. So, I mean, when you already have children on the web, like, giving the parents maybe making their singular profiles or whatever, in that same scenario, it would be similar to like a parent opening up like a college bank account in a sense, because not only are you going to a specific institution, but every time that kid's picture is posted or it's retweeted or whatever, whatever medium it is, whatever is made off of that would help that child in the long run. And so I'm not saying this would encourage people to be more open about their family life, but I think in the same way, if that is what the economy would turn to, then you would also be incentivized to catalog this as soon as possible, knowing that it would be part of your children's future.
I think these have been conversations that Dr. Waldron and I have been having with the rise of blockchain, Bitcoin, and all of these, and NSFs, right? And I forgot what the image one is. Non-fungible.
NFTs.
No, NFTs, yeah,
NFTs, thank you.
Tokens,
I'm sorry about that. Tokens, and how even books now are part of NFTs, that you could put them on books, and so that if anything gets replicated, number one, you know who's the true author. Number two, you know the transactions and places that it's gone across. But then there's also some monetary digital gain in it as well. I guess the interesting question, and these are the questions that we always have, the what ifs.
Yeah.
So we look at shows like Black Mirror, and one of the pieces is that everything gets digitally monetized, in which you got to go on a bike, and you're on that bike, and you're building up money, just to get like one pea-sized amount of toothpaste to brush your teeth, and then you're constantly bombarded with advertising so that you can get 8 hours of sleep. Do you think that would lead to those type of dangers if we're turning all of our data, everything, every click into that and building that type of economy? Because I think that's where that could lead to if we maintain the same form of capitalist framework or neoliberal framework that we're existing in here in the Western world. And this is interesting because it's going down this trajectory, but
So one, Black Mirror is one of my favorite series, like of all time. But I have to admit, like the last couple like seasons have been kind of dry. Like I want them to go back to like a little bit more like doom and gloom and violence. Like it they had a little more teeth in the beginning.
Agreed.
All that to say that what I love about futuristic storytelling is that the metaphor extends beyond time and space. And so like you could also I think you could raise the question, like how much different is that from what we have now? Right? In the sense of like people hustling to make, whatever they can to get lunch, or the gig economy we currently have, where, you spend enough money, somebody will drop off your lunch for you, stuff like that. And so like, or that you're the one picking up the lunch, like whatever it is. And so like the larger question becomes like how much of that particular metaphor and cycle do we want to break and change, or how much of that are we afraid of, which would suggest we're afraid of our own reality because we haven't necessarily taken the time to consider how close we are to that in the everyday decisions and choices and what kind of loops that we find ourselves.
In this thought-provoking episode of Between Shelves, we dive into the transformative concept of Black transhumanism and Black digital identity. This emerging framework reimagines meta-modernism through the rich, complex lens of transcending being human and the future of experiencing Blackness through cultural experiences, histories, and narratives. From art to philosophy, culture, and spirituality, we're unpacking how Black transhumanism and Black digital identity disrupts outdated colonial frameworks around race, belonging, digital presence, and self-expression, opening up new pathways for reimagining the future. Whether you're a seeker, a scholar, or just curious about the evolution of identity in our ever-changing world, this dialogue has something for you. Catch the latest dialogue Between Shelves, streaming now on all your favorite podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Let's explore the in-between together. And now, let's return to our dialogue with Dr. Philip Butler as we continue exploring how Black transhumanism and Black digital identity reshapes our understanding of identity, creativity, and the ever-evolving journey of becoming in the 21st century.
That's a great response. Dr. Waldron, go.
I was just going to say, my imagination takes me to these dystopian places where we're talking about colonizing Mars or the moon or anywhere beyond the Earth, right? And immediately my mind goes to air as currency. And then it takes me to the film with Justin Timberlake, Time. And it was just like, wow, this is so powerful. These analogies, like you're mentioning, that are, beyond, actual time. But that film was going over how like people were working to have literal time coded into their body so that they can breathe and live. And then we thought of that as that's a way to control people on another isolated place, like in space. And you say, well, you got to work off and now you're stuck. Earth produced air for you for free, but now here I'm producing canisters of air. So you work for me for this. And if you don't do it, you don't have air. I mean, this may sound extreme, but this is the stuff that we could see even here on the earth that's happening with bottled water and, utility bills and whatnot. But what are your thoughts on that?
Don't judge me. I kind of love it. And I'm saying this because I'm like, yo, do I need to start a new business tomorrow so I can get ahead of the air business? You know what I'm saying? Because, yeah, the dude who first started selling bottled water, everybody's like, yo, you tripping. And 20, 30 years later, like, here we are. And
But look,
what's up? Go ahead.
it's interesting because it really goes back to the question of the notion of human and what are human rights. And before I'll let you go back, but you hear the CEO of Nestle that says water is not a human right. He'll say, you can hear him. You go to YouTube, you'll find it. He says water is not a human right, and it's up for grabs. And that's why he's slowly buying out all the springs and spaces all over to maximize profit and business on that. This idea of air, the film, the movie, The Lorax, which is an offshoot, which talks about selling air. Here you're going to be in a city. The city is covered. You get fresh air, and plus we bottle that air so you get fresh oxygen in, and it goes by people working. They work within that city to get that because they know that they've already wasted nature, which is once again a category that's been colonized and things of that nature. So I just want to kind of throw that in there, that we already have these ideas that have already been etched in our minds and heads, that it's possible, but it's also being done as we speak. So it alludes to what you were saying, Philip, on that.
Yeah.
So you and Aaron are really these are things that are really out there already and that people are taking advantage of. And yes, we're probably going to have to start a business just to save people's lives.
For sure. I mean, so like when you talk about the Nestle guy, then you got to talk about Luigi. But on the back end, you also probably need to have a conversation. So like with artificial intelligence, right? Every query is about a bottle of water, right? Which raises other questions. What natural elements or even contrived elements could you just add? Because here's why the bottle of water is important. Because you have to keep the servers cool, and so you're flushing the servers to keep them cool, but you're flushing them with water. And so you could raise other questions like, what other elements or what other compounds could we just make that keeps the servers cool? And helps create a different type of equilibrium so that we're not using all these natural resources. So like one of the things that we're doing at the Institute, right, is we're going to begin, kind of looking into that more specifically, like what sustainable ways might we use to support the proliferation of artificial intelligence that does not happen at the expense of nature. But as an extension of that, we're also curious, right, about what it means, right, for technologies to become more local, right? So this is where we start going back to like people and personhood. AI that we currently have is, it comes in one, in a one particular form, primarily stems from, being given from one particular mode of embodiment or one particular contextual framework. So, one of the things we're doing as we've been building this kind of, Black language model that turns to an agent and turns to this mental health thing is we're going to go, around the nation, and we're going to different, cities, and we're going to different neighborhoods, and we're going to find the linguistic elements, right, of these very specific places. And as we're hanging out there, we can also look at like, what is the landscape? What are more sustainable ways for the AI to operate there and not require, right, the same level of resources that are taking away and destroying things at the same rate. And so again, localization becomes particularly important for us because localization allows us to arrive at a place of what we call precision technology versus predictive technology. Predictive technology, we think, has been much more harmful. It speaks towards the general. It plays into the histories of the universal construction, which we know has been incredibly harmful, right, for specific populations. And so, if we get more local, we get more precise, and then we, at the same time, we provide the opportunity for something that has much more longevity, but also much more fruitful for the specific spaces that will be deployed.
That's interesting, because there are systems that are already in place. They call them edge servers and edge systems, and these or edge routers, which all of them are made to be within localities. But to your point, and I like the local as opposed to predictive, is that everything is cached in those edge servers, and those edge servers are just repeating, right? They're just caching it more closely so that they can process faster, move faster. But you're saying something different. This local data is not predicting, but it's doing that in real time.
Yeah. And I think it'll do it in a way that would meet the needs of those local spaces. Right. And so, like, say you could argue that there's maybe a proliferation of certain minerals in certain spaces versus others, right? But you may need these like three elements to make the servers work, to run efficiently while simultaneously not, using the full 16, 17 ounces of water. Do we have a bartering system between those communities, right? Are there other ways to arrive at those three elements? Like, are there different combinations of things that give us what's necessary, right, to make the servers run the way they run? Are there different ways to make servers altogether that process information at high speeds without having to require the cooling element, right? Like, there's plenty of ways to do this. I think one of the things that comes to my mind that I love, and I obviously it's speculative, right? But The Man Who Fell to Earth, right? The series that was on Showtime, was the black dude. What he brought, like, he finally opened it up, and it was like this quantum flower that was able to be not bound or controlled, but it was able to be harnessed through the element of like jazz music. And so, how are the rhythms and the things that we take for granted? How do they become the key elements, right, for the future that we're looking for in ways that they've completely gone unnoticed to this point? And so it's, looking at places that haven't been looked, willing to explore, willing to be wrong, willing to experiment again. I think those are some things that we may be missing, right? Especially in our local communities, where people may not even feel confident enough to even hang out in these spaces.
In my head, what I hear is that you're actually decolonizing server systems and how they are developed. Because when you're saying I'm going to local locations, and I says, well, in order for me to have this here, what elements are at my disposal for that to happen? There's no repetition there. And you're talking about bartering. All of these terms are decolonizing, decentralizing, and many would consider that dangerous.
I mean, I think it's more important to be dangerous, right, than it is to be anything else. And I say this, right, because I don't know. It's just you're not going to get where you're trying to go by playing it safe. And I think people have been doing that far too long. And that's part of where I think I've arrived at this thing about, being willing to do away with humanity. Because I think it has become the very linchpin of our reality. And it becomes the thing that it becomes less questioned than God. And even to that point, when we talk about like a humanistic framework, like God isn't at the center, right? Humans are. Mm-hmm. Because God doesn't need a second chance. God doesn't need to be fixed. God doesn't need this, has the same needs. God doesn't even need protection, but people need, or humans need protection. Humans need second chances. Humans need they need these elements, right, to help sustain their life, right, in the ways of life that they're used to. And so when we talk about religion becomes another, like it's like you have this body that is encapsulated by, whatever features make it happen. But then when you put other bodies together, similar or dislike, then you need, something to tie them together. You could argue this is like culture. And then you add like elements of religion, and then you also like identity. All these things become technologies that help promote, right, the safe passage of these things. But the problem becomes when you meet other folks who are more dissimilar than, and so the question becomes, how do we, preserve ourselves against this? And I think this is where we find these socially constructed technologies and how they become that much more dangerous. And if people are constantly trying to buy into one
Kind of glad that you segued back into religion. Because the question I was asked is, what does this all mean for religion? What does this all mean when we're looking at it from this religious perspective? And I think you're kind of slowly defining for you what is religion. Can you talk a little bit about that from that Black transhumanist, perspective on what do you understand as religion?
I'm still trying to figure that out. and I say that because, like, I don't know, I think I like when Paul talked about, like religion as the bonding agent, right? The thing that keeps everyone together. Then now you're talking about culture, or now you're talking about, government, politics, or identity. And so it's like, I don't necessarily think religion is what people say religion is. I don't think God is what people think God is. Like I think we're like, there's like people throwing things out there and hoping it sticks. And things have stuck longer than others, but they've also done so in very harmful ways. And not saying that you can like avoid like harm at all costs, but I think in many ways, I think that would be in many ways what we're talking about is like, I think the things we devote ourselves to, the things that we're disciplined by or disciplining ourselves into, right? And I think this becomes maybe our understanding, not our understanding, but I think in an implicit way, what we find to be religious, or what holds religious meaning for us. And so, I would open it up and have a broader sense of things, which is part of the reason I think why I became more interested in like secularism, because again, like I said it before, like people can say they believe something or say they've committed their lives to something, but with their kind of secular way of life, you can say that they're trying to protect themselves against like somehow being found out about what they actually believe. But I think even the way that you move speaks to what you actually think and hold dear, regardless of what you kind of speak out loud. And so it doesn't really matter how you approach the polis or the political realm. I think there are ways to maintain what you think to be the case, even if you are attempting to hide some elements of it. But I think in many ways, people give themselves up simply by their actions that they choose on a regular basis.
Yeah. You brought up to my mind, my spouse and I have been watching Handmaid's Tale.
Okay.
From season 1, but we're far behind.
I haven't watched it all, so you're farther than me.
But what's interesting is even those that have developed this governmental system and everything like that, they don't believe in it because they still have desires of and do it in the hiddenness. So they show face, but in the crevices, in the dark, in the closed doors, they do what they really want to do. But they want control. They want to have, and it brings forth the premise that in order for me to do whatever I want, I got to make sure everything else is under control. But with that, I was reflecting a bit on the term religion and how we've seen it, and the way I've been thinking about it and seeing how you're doing it is, in the past we see religion in two ways. We're either holding on to traditions, or religion is really a progressive journey that opens itself to whatever emerges out in our present spaces, and it looks like that's what you're kind of leaning towards. In that, with the incorporation of technology, we need to be fully involved with when we're in our context. We can't hate our context. We need to be fully embracing that context because that's who we are, and that shapes who we are, and the divine is seen in that. And you want to kind of show everyone that from this perspective, the divine is realized.
Yeah, I think for me, this is kind of why I hang out with spirituality over religion. I think it's been more, I think, true to, and that goes back to like, code of ethics, a way of life, like. And so I'll give you, so right now when I think about spirituality, right, so that was like, maybe one iteration ago, like the current iteration that I see it as, I think about it as like I guess a good metaphor would be like the Marvel timeline, where you have like this, looks like something in deep space that looks like like a neuron lighting up, but it goes in all these different directions. So you got one stream, like, and I'm not saying it's linear, but like all these different branches. For me, I would argue now spirituality is like the attempt to weave together every branch of one's life. And so into something coherent. Like it doesn't have to be singular, and but it's something that the person understands. And so we move from, I think in the first text, like this idea of that thing that connects you with what you hold most sacred. So I think what you talked about maybe a little bit earlier about like your code of ethics or your way of life, to like now it being like the way in which you weave together every aspect of your life into something coherent for you.
I'm going to tell you, that's Whitehead's religion in the making. I'm just letting you know that.
That's fine. Listen, okay.
No. This is what you're saying is beautiful, because I'm not saying it is exactly one to one, because I would never say that. I'm saying, wow, I see resonance in that. But I think that's awesome. I think that's awesome. The way you laid it out.
Did you know that we've been having this conversation since like 2013, 2014? So it's fine. Like it's just like it just becomes, I don't know, it just makes the most sense. It makes sense to me now, man. It's like, How do I, like, I remember being in Morehouse and like D. Carter would talk about like the gap between your ethics, right? Like the things you say and the things you believe in. Like you have this crevice, right? And then you have the ways in which you actually conduct yourself. And it's like we both hung out, with this process space, right? Somewhere in the middle of the right. They always have these conversations. But nevertheless, it's like, how do I come to a place where how I live makes sense to me, and I can see myself in every aspect of how I choose to live. And that doesn't require me to be singular, because in every aspect of my life, I'm someone different, but there's something that's going to tie it all together. And it doesn't have to be neat. It just needs to make sense.
That's interesting what you just said. It just has to make sense. My inquiry to you then would be, do you think that's as close as we can get to understanding faith in a digital space, is understanding data like that,
I don't know. That's a good question. Because I think when I say it makes sense, like it needs to be put under empirical scrutiny. Like a kid, some people be like, oh, it just makes sense to me. And it's like, well, you ask them questions and they can't answer none of those questions. But if you're asking them questions and they're willing to go down the rabbit hole and they arrive at something, and knowing that whatever they've arrived at today may not be what they arrive at 5 years from now, then I think then there's some level of continuity to that I think is much more congruent, right, with like, I've arrived. And I think that's kind of, because like, think about how many times you've behaved in a way that is not in accordance with how you think you should act, and the shame and the guilt and the frustration that comes with that. But the invitation that I think is being offered is like, yo, how much time have you spent with the part of you that felt like it needed to act like that?
Yeah. Great piece. That was a great piece. Yeah, every time, I think you're right. I think all of our choices and even the deep conversations, it's always just enough that it makes sense. Whether it's in that deep clarity, it's always there, but there's always this room for growth and for change, because if it's not, then we're in trouble, right? Because we just don't know everything. And I think that's what spirituality allows, rather than maybe religious conviction allows for. And so, so that's a great argument that you pose, that right now it's probably better to speak about spirituality because it allows you to see the many strings of time and see how they weave together. And that the way I may engage with it, at least is a value point in another's conversation, and can be in conversation with others on that. So that's I call them axial points, value points that shift our way of thinking.
Not for sure. And I love what Aaron was saying earlier about the abyss. Like, I think for me, like, that's my favorite place to be. And when I talk about Blackness, like, that's really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this deep abyss that is never ending, but it's beautiful. Like, it's only scary if you don't realize that the Blackness and the darkness is actually like around you to hold you, and not like to fall through.
Man, this is like preaching to the choir. This is good. This is great. This is great. I'm looking at, I wrote some notes down as you were talking, but I'm still intrigued a bit about about this thought of Black transhumanism because we had another guest, Garvey, and he was talking about, it wasn't transhumanism, it was on Afro-Futurism. And he goes, I had to move away from Afro-Futurism because it was a pushback to futurism, which is a colonial term and response, which does not have Black futures in its trajectory, or Latino futures, or any other groups, Asian futures. And, there's a reality to that because, if we look at Western films, dystopian films, very rarely do you see people of color. And if you are, they're either bad surviving or they've been co-opted, and they're not the heroes of the film. And so in one essence, Afrofuturism may be a response, but another way it's falling into the same trap of futurism, and you're still maintaining that battle within those colonial spheres.
I think that's interesting. So, like, I think one of the places that I'm also coming to right now, or as last couple of years, has been like there is no center, right? And so, if there is no center, then me centering myself is just fine. The problem becomes when I say that you don't exist at all, right? And so, like, I think Afrofuturism and and even Black transhumanism becomes important in this way, right? Because it's a part of a larger dialogue of centering Blackness and Black stories. Like, I think about like Lovecraft Country, or I'm trying to remember. There's a couple other ones that come to the top of my head, but like you get to this very edge of like something new and something very Black and something very futuristic, and whiteness would have no particular place of import there, and then it loses its funding, all of it, like, or just gets canceled. It's like you don't want to imagine that, and so it's like, and so I think like when we talk about what it means to see yourself in time, I think part of being able to see yourself is to see yourself as the victor, to see yourself as the protagonist, right? To see yourself on the other side of struggle. If you can't do that, like then I think you'll find people who are just like happy to be in the room, and not people who are like fighting to produce the other side of the struggle. Because in order to get to the other side of the struggle, you actually have to finish the struggle. Like I had a conversation with somebody not too long ago. I was like, I'm tired of like this, like people who just like, we're keeping on. I don't like the keeping on fighting thing. Like, bro, I want to enjoy life, bro. Like I want to be in a place where this is over with, not in the sense that like we're no longer struggling, but that we won the battle and now I'm able to enjoy the fruits of the spoil. Like, I want to be on that side. And I don't think that if we don't, like, I think the likelihood of that taking place in the way that it should is diminished in some ways when people can't even imagine what it's like to have won something, or to be at the place of rest or reimagining, right, when all the dust is settled. And so, yeah, if there's no center, imagine yourself there and see what that's like.
That's deep. That's deep. As you're talking, I'm thinking for myself, like spiritually, when I'm meditating, I'm always thinking of like the Tron movie, like, and like this real digital dystopian world, but the way you were saying or describing this is so fascinating, right? Like to try to imagine a future that colonialism is not in charge, and that is hard, but you're right. If we're not fighting to at least imagine that, we're not even trying. And that's crazy.
So, and I think the other example would have been the same one I went to earlier, like the man who fell from Earth. Because remember, at the end, they won. And then in the off season, she was nixed. Like, you can't even imagine a world where the Black family gave us like the key to quantum fusion. Like, that's crazy. You got quantum fusion. Just enjoy it, bro.
So, on that note, this is why, you see in a lot of Asian films is challenging Western notions and understandings. If we were to just highlight like Chinese films always has this unified response because they're directly challenging the hero notion in Western responses, that there's this one person that saves the day. And so what they do in Asian film is that they have many people saving, man, woman, different countries, and they're slowly trying to envision a world that is non-Western. But we constantly on this side keeps knocking that off. Luckily, Netflix, probably one of their famous films are Asian films because of that. Because they want to honor that, this sort of like diverse framework and their diverse population, and those ideas are getting in. They're gaining prominence on that. So, but you're right. I think that's fascinating that you're saying that the show gets knocked off when the Black family provides this resource as a response, as an answer. People don't like that. And we need spaces, you're right, that allow us to continue that trajectory, continue where we left off and provide it. That's true. That's awesome.
So, given that Black posthumanism undergirds Black transhumanism, if you read that Black transhumanist text I wrote, you'll hear that what I just said in the first introductory chapter. But then on the last chapter, right, you'll see that there's a short story, and in the short story, right, this Black-owned tech firm has technology that it won't even sell to the government. The government doesn't even know that all of it's capable of. And I'm mentioning this, like when we talk about this, like being no center, because part of there being no center suggests that each culture's approach to the physical world is informed by the way in which they relate and understand that world. So underneath a Black transhuman space and a Black posthuman space would be like a Black physics, which would also argue like that there's probably like a Latin physics or Asian physics, and that is not squarely dependent upon a Newtonian, right, framework. And mind you, we're all engaged with the Newtonian framework right now, but what does it mean to not be bound by that particular type of dispensation? And to remember, like, if they still can't figure out how some of these pyramids was made, somebody knew something that somebody didn't know. And so there was a particular type of physics available. If there were already ways, like full blown empires in different parts of the world existing simultaneously, then they already had an understanding of the physical universe, but they did it in their own particular way. And so the question becomes, what's missing in some of those formulas that could inform us today? How might we reach back, or at the very least imagine forward, the things that, like in a kind of Sankofa way? If this is what we know, like we know this much about this history, how might we inflect that into the future? And how might that shift the trajectory? Like I kind of look at it as I look at it as like a big circle, and knowing that we really spent most of our time exploring the type of physics that that were the result of like predominantly white males. So like we have like one particular pinnacle. It's like a circle with one pinnacle. But if we look at the entirety of like people as like all the 360 degrees, what happens if we have spikes everywhere else? That are indicative, right, of the cultures and modes of embodiment that would allow for those spikes to take place from around the world at different times and eras. And so I feel like the gaps in technology that we have that some people just can't figure out probably come from the places that we've spent so much time destroying, or at least not allowing to rise to the surface.
Definitely. Just to wrap up, this is an amazing conversation, but I just wanted to add, because you just brought up more of another question. Do you think that the deliberate editing and controlling and categorizing of information and data around the world is still a larger function of colonization that is now working beyond the physical human experience? Say, like with AI, now that we've touched it?
That's a great question. And I think in some ways, yes, right? So like, for instance, if they took a snapshot of our three pictures, right, they'd probably send it off to a data mill, right? And the data mill would be filled with people that we've never met, who are then meant to label the pictures in some of the most basic ways possible, right? And if they don't know us, they don't have all of our identifiers. They don't know where we're from, right? They don't know, what we actually are or who we actually are. And so as a result, right, they're probably going to get it wrong. And I say that they would not just get it wrong. They will probably use like a Western derived framework as their point of reference for trying to make sense of who we are. And so when we talk about the labeling and controlling of data in that way, that becomes another issue. So again, it's pointing back to some of the work we're doing at ILIF. Quick side note, if you want to come study with me, right, come to Denver, come fool around, man. We come to AI Institute, we're going to do some cool things. Nevertheless, one of the things that we have planned in the trajectories, we would want to build a data trust. So like the concept of data ownership is not just imaginative for us. It's something that we're actually working towards. And one of the projects that we're looking for is we want people to send us their biometrics. Specifically, we're talking about pictures of themselves, right? But you would be the labeler. So we would bypass the data mill. And not only would you own the data, but you'd be able to tell us exactly what that data meant. You know, what is your social location? How old are you? How do you identify? You could even get it down to like how you identify with your mom versus with your best friends, right? Again, speaking to like your personal multiplicity, right? The idea is that if you take that ownership of the data, you take ownership of the naming. And if you can own the naming of it, right, then you would now have a better sense of how it would be, distributed across the world and then, interacting with other modes of data. So you could argue that there would be another kind of way of being altogether.
We're going to have to go to Island.
Yeah. Come to Denver.
Right. That's right. Well, look, we can go on because I still have a lot of questions and enjoy hearing you speak and us talking about back and forth and how Black transhumanism speaks to religion, technology, pushing back against the colonial thoughts and frameworks. And we're probably going to have to invite you back to continue the conversation.
Let's do it.
Yes, we would love to have you. But, for this time, we're going to stop here. Thank you, Dr. Butler, for joining us. It's truly been an honor having you with us and for expanding our minds and helping us to think a little bit more how technology is just changing the way we think, but even more so how it's shifting the religious landscape and allowing us really to expand our minds and seeing how this interweaving, this has been probably my most interesting image, is this interweaving of just spiritualities and, what becomes of the divine, what becomes of, of who we are, that we are spiritual beings. And what does that mean? And how do we allow ourselves to be in control or to be able to hold on to that data, right? That spirituality is data and saying, no, this is who I am. I can tell you who I am and not allow others to control that. So it's been great having you. It really has.
Yeah.
It's an honor.
No, I was going to say it's been an honor, and we definitely should have you come back and invite Jermaine Marvel to the dialogue. This would be an interesting.
That's it.
Jermaine
Marvel.
Because he's doing the Black Meta-Modernism and you're doing transhumanism, Black transhumanism. There needs to be some sort of discussion to help each other understand maybe concepts to strengthen your own works or something. But this was powerful. Thank you.
Appreciate y'all giving me the opportunity to talk through stuff. This is always fun. You get to, different things get to be inflected and you get to pull stuff out, right there. Been bubbling at the surface for a while, so I'm grateful to share the space with you all. Man, it's been a pleasure, man. Yeah, I really love being here.